Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Bhattacharya with America Achieves and your TA Coalition. I'm so excited to be here today to close out our fifth and final session of TA over the last 2 days. We started yesterday thinking big picture about vision and how you define success with clear outcomes, talked through equity, got to think a lot about partnerships and what effective commitments look like. And then today, spent a good amount of time hearing from experts in the field about how you think about your projects in the most robust way. We're now going to sort of pull out of the weeds and think really big picture about how to tell a compelling story. This element is so important to building your coalition and making sure everyone's aligned in one cohesive vision, but also in terms of building trust and really creating the roadmap forward for your entire community. So I'm so excited to introduce to you today, Bill Burton. Bill has an extensive career in strategic messaging and communications, including leading and guiding national presidential campaign messaging strategy, working with major corporations to help define their story, serving in the White House with President Obama as a deputy press secretary. And now he currently serves as the founder and president of Bryson Gillette, a strategic communications firm located in Santa Barbara, which I know might make people a little jealous today. Essentially, he lives and breathes the powerful storytelling. So I'm excited to pass it over to him and listen and learn together. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you all so much for this opportunity to be with you today. I got to spend some time in your proposals and really living in the facts and the figures and the regions. And you guys are working on such awesome projects that it's so great to know about the creativity and the forceful intention around these coalitions and the projects that you're building. And I just want to spend a little time today trying to think beyond the numbers and the facts and figures that are in those proposals and think about how we're gonna build some stories that help you to be successful in getting phase 2 funding, but also successful in your communities with leaders, elected officials, and just members of the community who are gonna be the folks that you need in order to be successful on these projects. So I've broken down this conversation into a handful of parts. I'll say them now and I'll say them again as we're going through, just so that you have a sense of where we're going. We're gonna talk about audience. We're gonna talk about telling the story of your region, telling the story of your project, and then painting a picture of what success looks like. So the thing that got me so excited about this was looking at these projects and realizing that with the force of these investments, this could be like a new deal, but one driven by equity. And being able to tell that story is crucial to your success. So first and foremost, who's your audience? In the immediate term, right, you're speaking with federal officials who are making decisions on funding. Then there's other funding partners that you could potentially have. Then there's those folks in your community. And then asking the question, how are you best gonna get your story across to those audiences? Part of the answer to that question is the voices that you pick, right? Some of these coalitions are very broad. They're made up of, a lot of different groups and voices. Thinking clearly about who's best at articulating your mission, your goals, your successes right from the beginning, I think is going to be important in how people hear what you have to say. And since this is all driven by equity, being thoughtful about diversity right from day one is going to be really important as well. Allison talked about how today we're going to get out of the weeds and get into the big picture. Telling the story, I think, of the big picture can sometimes start with individual voices. So your regions. One of the things that impressed me about the proposals was the diversity of geography that we're dealing with. And from Appalachian coal country to timber country to the great ports of our country, all of these different places have a story of their own that's deeply American, that's rooted in the tradition of what our country is and what it can be. And they all have their own specific challenges. And those challenges can be discussed in a whole lot of different ways. But take my hometown, for example, Buffalo, New York. Buffalo is known for, buffalo wings, snow, and our football team. Maybe you know it for something else. I certainly know it for other things too, but I get our reputation. But let's say your mission were to, for example, there's talk of getting a new stadium for the football team. So how do you convince a community that a new stadium is important, even to people who don't necessarily care about football? And you can talk about the Bills' record. You can talk about their best players, Josh Allen, and what his statistics are. But ask yourself, what's going to be more important for somebody who's paying attention to the news? Is it just the Bills' record, or is it, the story of a dad who's taken his daughters to every home game for the last 15 years, or something that's particularly human that reaches people, that isn't just about facts and figures? So as you've established the story of your region, tell the story of your project. Who will benefit? What's unique about your doing? Who's in the coalition? And what's the headline that you're going to get if the funding comes through? Now, when you're telling the story of the project, the faces of the people who benefit are particularly important. And if you just take the State of the Union address, for example, I've watched everyone since I was 11. I'm a huge nerd, have been my whole life. I just hadn't discovered the State of the Union until I was 11. In each one of them, the president gives off a laundry list of different proposals and initiatives, tells the story of what's happening in the country, but the coverage is always focused on not just that laundry list of proposals or the stats and figures behind the different projects. It's the people who he highlights who are up in the rafters, who come and help to tell part of the story. When he expanded SCHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, from 8 to 11 million kids, he didn't just talk about the 3 million expansion. People can't understand numbers that are in the millions. Nobody can. I can't. But what they understood were those kids who were up in the balcony who would have healthcare but didn't right now. And the force of the expansion would be meaningful in their lives in a way that was, particularly important to convey. And when you're telling the story of your project, emphasizing the urgency of it, I think is going to be an important part of folks understanding, just why we have to move on this right now, right? This comes from the Rescue Act, right? We're in the act of rescue because there is an emergency. And, we've just gone through real time in our country and we're still in it. So painting the picture for the urgency, for the people who would be impacted, and what impact that will have on the lives of members of the community, even if they're not touched specifically by the program, is going to be an important part of getting across what you're doing and why you're doing it and why you're doing it right now. So finally, not quite finally, but painting a picture of success. So what does success look like? Not just if you get funding, but in 5 or 10 years. Those faces, those people, the groups, the voices from the coalition, what will it mean in their lives 5 or 10 years from now? What's it going to mean for the community or the region as a whole 5 or 10 years from now? Because I think that if you're focused on the faces and those people in the community and the stories of where we have been, where we are right now, and where we're going, you complete the picture for people to help them understand exactly what it is that you're doing. So now finally, I want to think about questions because I'd love for this to be a discussion, not just me talking at you. you'll see in the deck that gets sent around after this, a message triangle. And the message triangle is an exercise I go through with all my clients, whether they're, the comms team for a huge corporation, a candidate for Senate, or a local nonprofit that is just trying to figure out how to get a little more attention for the urgency of the problems that they're trying to solve. Think of it, to visualize it, think of at the top, you've got the problem, and then you've got the solution, and you've got the result. And in the middle, you've got your core message. And if you sit with figuring out how you're describing the problem, keeping in mind everything that I've said already about telling a story, and the humans who are impacted or will be impacted, and then describing your solution in a way that is the most condensed but effective way to describe it, and then the result that you're looking for, the combination of those in the center, that should be your core, most authentic, most effective message that you are getting across to funders, to the community, to all the people who need to know the awesome story of what it is that you're trying to do in your community. So I encourage you to go through that exercise. If it's hard, I encourage you to get help going through that exercise, because getting to the bottom of that, getting to your core authentic message and having everything radiate from that in all the different platforms where you're trying to communicate, I think is going to be your best path to success. So that's what I've come to say. But if you forget everything else that I said, and remember one thing, it's just don't forget the humans. This is a human story that you're trying to tell. Yes, there are millions of dollars at stake, billions of dollars at stake. Yes, there are millions of lives that will be impacted, but what people will remember is the human stories of those who you're trying to touch. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it, and happy to take any questions.
Bill, I have a question for you. One of the challenges of this opportunity is that, it's a very growth-driven opportunity. So numbers are implicit in telling the story. How do you recommend applicant teams think about the need to have some quantitative outcomes that are very specific, but also speak to that humanistic piece? Like, what are some tips people could think about as they're trying to craft a narrative that is, finite in length, but packed full of the right details?
Well, I think if consider your audience, because some of the people who you're speaking with at any particular time may be very data driven, right? They may be the sort of people who want a lot of numbers. So I think that you have to be intentional about considering the balance of what you're doing from a data and analytics standpoint versus how you're doing the human story. There should always be a mix. I think for the most part, the mix should be more human than data, but sometimes not. And I think that the answer to that question lies in who's the audience that you're speaking to at any particular time, first and foremost. Second, as long as what you're saying is radiating from your core message, I think that it gives you a lot of room to run on either part of that balance.
Thanks. Next question is, what I hear you saying is this story is going to be, implicit in the narrative, but can be a jumping off place for how applicant teams are talking to their communities at large, how they're preparing to think about engaging the media, how they're potentially talking to funders and other federal agencies. Is it the same story throughout? Those core messages, are they supposed to be implicit in everything, or do you tailor and consider audiences in different contexts here?
Good question. I think any good messenger or politician is very good at having some part of their core message as a part of everything that they do, no matter what. And there are variations on it, but for President Biden, build back better, right? Like, that was a part of everything that he was talking about. Now, is it applicable if he's talking about, foreign policy, or different issues at the United Nations? Not necessarily, but there is always a way to weave back the build back better message into the fact that we're trying to make America stronger economically, we're also trying to have a stronger place on the global stage, and build back our reputation. So I think for individual projects, when your voices are out there talking about the project, it would be helpful to have some line that is woven into everything that you do. It doesn't have to be a slogan necessarily, but just like some sense of what is it that you're trying to do, whether it's lift a particular region or community through some particular approach. But I think having variance around that, depending on who the audience is, helps keep it interesting.
Great. Here's a question from the audience. Entities or organizations typically like to solve problems by themselves. After all, they were created to help solve a problem. What's the best or most effective way to bring other entities on board to show how the Build Back Better Regional Challenge project can assist in helping to solve problems that are aligned with that organization's mission?
When I was a kid in Minnesota, where I went to college, Senator Paul Wellstone was still in office. And he had this line, "We all do better when we all do better." And I think inspiring that notion of trying to lift all boats as opposed to being competitive. I think one of the cool things about this process is that instead of having, a bunch of regional players compete against each other, it's the regions, it's coalitions within the regions working with each other in order to do better. Everybody's going to be different in the best way to get them on board, and your local politics better than I ever could. But I think finding common ground, finding common purpose in how you even describe the challenges that you're trying to work towards together, and maybe frankly cutting some turf and taking one piece of a problem and working on that, and hoping that another group that you're trying to get the support of will work on another piece of it. So I think every coalition is going to be different. Every group is going to be different to deal with. It's just a matter of finding a way to help people understand that notion that we all do better when we all do better.
Great. And as we're thinking about sort of brass tacks going from this high-level conversation to what's next for each applicant team, in a coalition, let's say, that has 5 different members and may have slightly 5 different perspectives on why they're engaged, what do you think there could be their most immediate next step to figure out how they take that message triangle and really distill their core messages that do collectively invest and engage them, and then can be used to bring others on board too?
Well, I think sitting with the message triangle and getting to the core message is crucially important in that process. And then, I think in every region, it's going to be different, whether you call for a conference of, the groups that you're trying to get into the coalition, whether you run a earned media campaign where you're going to reporters and column writers and editorial boards and ramping up the urgency and the notion that people should be working together. Or maybe there's, some sort of targeted digital campaign that you could run where you put static or video ads on social media or on Google or on different websites to help to push the notion that you're trying to solve this problem and you need partners in order to do it. And it's a campaign in order to help make that happen. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to do it.
Great. One of the challenges for applicant teams, again, is thinking about the parameters of the NOFO and what can be included in the narrative. And I think it's important for everyone to realize the narrative we're talking about is relevant to your application, but really it is the bigger story you're seeking to tell and the vision you're creating more broadly. As applicant teams grapple with what to include in in their application versus what to share more broadly, is there guidance you can give them about what actual next steps would be wise taking those messages, and then how do you think about pivoting from the narrative to your media pitch, to your funders, to bringing in additional community organizations?
Well, I think having the core message is important, and having that as part of that, like using the application to make the message, central to that communication along with all the other communications, I think is where you start. And then after that, you consider audiences, and you think about, well, if I'm taking this to the media, or if I've got a static ad on Facebook that people are going to see for 4 seconds when they fly through the site, how do I distill that core message into even a smaller message in order to be effective? I think, oftentimes it's about hiring professionals to help you come and do it. But if you're doing it with, your coalition and the coalition of folks that you're trying to communicate with, I think you once you've distilled down what the common agreement on what the core issue is that you're trying to address, working with that group to really hammer out something that that is compelling, but also doesn't sound like it was designed by a committee, right? Which is a real challenge. And I think you have to lean on like human interactions and relationships in order to manage that. And, having leadership from a messaging standpoint to find the message and drive it forward with your group and with other groups on all the different platforms where you're trying to do it is key. Great.
I don't see any other questions coming in from the audience. I wonder if it's worth just recapping some next steps. I hear you saying, keep it simple, keep it human-centered, make sure there's clear messages that everyone's speaking from. Think about the headline you want to see as a result of what you're seeking to create. And think about your audience consistently and constantly, how to use these messages to tailor to those audiences. Is there any other specific guidance or next steps you'd encourage applicant teams to consider as they go from here to strengthening their application and really bringing this transformational opportunity to life?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, tell a human story. Even though you're telling the story of projects and numbers that are very big, make sure that it always comes back to a human story. So I would say, go give the message triangle a try, get to your core message, and let that be the thing that is driving all your communications.
Terrific. I think we might be ready to close it out then. Thanks so much, Bill, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. And thank you all for listening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all.